Yes, we are live now.
All right. Good evening and welcome to this special governance entrepreneurship class at Ashoka University with Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a member of parliament, author, and former senior diplomat at the United Nations. This session is being broadcast live on Facebook and will also be available for viewing later on YouTube. Dr. Tharoor is, as we all know, is a third-term member of parliament from Thiruvananthapuram and in Kerala, is the best-selling author of 22 books, both fiction and non-fiction, besides being the former Under-Secretary General at the United Nations and a former Minister of State for Human Resources and External Affairs in the Government of India. Dr. Tharoor has won numerous awards, in particular, more recently, the Sahitya Academy Award for his book, An Era of Darkness, in the non-fiction category. Dr. Tharoor chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, but as we're all aware, he's a champion of many other issues. For me personally, Dr. Tharoor was one of the first champions of the Good Samaritan law in India, and it's been a pleasure to work with him in getting it passed in the Parliament. Dr. Tharoor, welcome to this class. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much, Piyush. It's good to see you all, and I'm very pleased that it's a pleasure to be in your class, and particularly with the remarkable students of Ashoka, which has already earned a justified reputation for the quality of education on offer and the quality of the student body. So I'm looking forward to a good interaction with all of you.
Thank you, sir. I also wanted to take this opportunity to introduce my co-faculty in the course, Dr. PriyankNarayan, who's the director of the Center for Entrepreneurship at Ashoka as well.
Hello, nice to meet you, Priyank.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you here at Ashoka.
Thank you, good to see you.
Dr. I'll start off. One of the things that we're trying to teach in this course is how do you engage with power? Where does power lie? And, how do you start engaging with it? But I wanted to start off by asking you, Dr. Tharoor, what does power mean to you? And how can young change makers, especially those in this class, can engage with power to, bring about change at scale?
Right. Well, the various understandings of power, as you know, Piyush, I mean, many people think of it in terms of strength, of force, of might, the possession of control or command over people. That's one way of looking at power. Another is more sort of related to office and position, authority, having the rights by a particular position. You have to do things or to act in certain ways. And then, of course, there is the simple understanding of power in terms of political or national strength. I tend to be very attracted to a definition that Joseph Nye, the Harvard scholar, gave when he wrote about soft power. When he talked about power is essentially the ability to get other people to do what you want. And I thought that was a very interesting idea. And that's why he talked about hard power, where you can force people to do something you want, and soft power, where you can persuade through attraction to get people to do something you want. But that's a different matter. But ultimately, power is all about your ability or capacity to act. If you are powerless, that means you cannot act in any particular situation. You're helpless. Whereas if you have power, it means you have the capability to act and to do something. And to my mind, that would be, in my understanding, what power is all about. Now, obviously, for example, when my party is in government or I'm a minister, though I'm never fond of the word power, I am in a position to act, to take certain decisions, or to participate in my party, my government taking decisions. When I'm in the opposition, for many of the things I need to accomplish for my constituents, I don't have that power because the other side is in power. And what I need to do is to persuade. I need to work with people who have the power to get the things done that I can't do because I don't have it. So that's very simply what I understand by power.
Right. And so the other part of my question was, how can young people, how can young change makers engage with that power? What's the, are there any things they should keep in mind, or do you have an approach in mind that people can take to?
There are different kinds of power. Again, if you're thinking of political power in this context and only political power, then the answer is obviously a little more straightforward, because there are various other kinds of power in the world that I wouldn't necessarily recommend that young people feel obliged to engage with. But the question of political power in a democracy is that it is exercised in the name of the people. And young people are the people, as well as older people being the people, who have ultimately to go to the people who exercise that power and say, this is what we demand in the name of the people in whose name you are exercising that power. That's the basic logic within a democracy. So, for example, as an MP, I get dozens of requests every day, or it varies, of course, from day to day. But certainly whenever I meet people in the constituency, or I take their calls or receive their visits, it is always to do with things they want me to do for them. And that's a situation which many of the young people may not have found themselves in, but which they're actually entitled to. You can go to your MP with any problem and say, listen, you have to resolve this for me. Your job is to be the interface between me and those in government who can deliver that particular answer, that particular solution. So that's the first thing, is to use the mechanisms available in our democracy, in our government, to be able to seek the assistance you want. That's one kind of engagement with power. Another one is to go directly to those who are holding power, for example, to give them your ideas, or to offer to work with them, to intern for them, to assist them. And that's something that many young people do. And I think it was relatively uncommon some time ago. Today in India, our situation has evolved much more, and a lot more people in power are welcoming and willing to engage with young people coming in and working with them. So these are other ways in which they can engage. The third one is, of course, the action from a distance. That is, you can write a letter, you can issue a tweet, you can send a message to people in authority, telling them where they're going wrong, or telling them what to do right, or making a request, and people do all of that as well. So these are the three broad means in our democracy of engaging with people who are exercising power or wielding power.
Right, right. Tharoor, we call this course Governance Entrepreneurship, which is essentially combining the spirit of enterprise with the scale of government to create big change. I'm wondering, in your career in the government and in the parliament, have you come across examples of governance entrepreneurship, live in action?
Plenty. I mean, I can give you a couple of examples. One very recent, in fact, and one from my own stint in my political party. I was invited. I actually suggested some years ago to the Congress Party leadership that we needed to tap the talents of the professionals in our country and ask those professionals to engage with politics. I knew from growing up in a middle-class professional household that I would often see my father and his friends working hard, paying their taxes, coming home, and in the evening over a drink or a cup of tea, complaining about the politicians. And I often wondered why such qualified and able people could not do more than just, if you like, complain. And I realized they didn't really have a platform in which they could express their views. Now, let our party provide one and give them an opportunity to have a platform that they can engage with. So I actually went to the party leadership. It took me a while to persuade them. This has not actually been a very, very, shall we say, not been a very natural fit in the past, the professional class and the political class. So it required a bit of entrepreneurship. I was doing something that hadn't been done before. I had to set up an institution from scratch within a 120-year-old political party, 130-year-old political party by the time I got going. And therefore it was an interesting challenge, but we made up things as we went along. I was inspired by the Rotary model. I was often invited to address Rotary clubs and Rotary districts. And I understood how the concept worked, that professionals got around, often in a locality, met regularly, exchanged ideas, came up with their own schemes, were also guided by district level schemes, state level schemes, national level, and sometimes in the case of Rotary, international level schemes. And I thought, great, this is a very good model to follow. And it's also something that many professionals are familiar with. So why don't I try and replicate that, which is what I did. And then writing bylaws, writing the messages in which we can actually get people involved was interesting. Now, one of the challenges I discovered is that the kind of professionals who are willing to come on to a political platform are not necessarily, I say this because I'm sure it's sometimes going to surprise me, it's not necessarily the most entrepreneurial. That is that I expected that as with Rotary clubs, there might be self-starters, that they themselves might be willing to come up with their own ideas and do their own things. But I discovered that many of them actually required more direction from the leadership of the All India Professionals Congress than I had expected. And I also discovered that we had therefore very uneven performances. Some states were far more energetic, creative, expansive, and effective than others. But all of this is part of the interesting challenge of setting up a startup within the political arena. And that startup is still functioning. The numbers are growing, even though we have meanwhile encountered a bad setback politically in the elections. And certainly immediately after the election defeat, there was a period of some uncertainty and some, shall we say, disillusionment among some members, which I think they have now overcome, and they've come together with a lot of energy and drive. So that's one example. The other kind of example of political entrepreneurship is not with the party so much as doing something for the constituency that needed help. Yeah, I'll tell you what happened was that on the last day of the parliament session, the truncated parliament session in March, when we were essentially interrupted by the continuing eruptions of COVID, and they decided to suspend the session. In a courtesy gesture, many of us went to the speaker to thank him for his leadership and wish him well. And the prime minister was one of the people there. So I asked the prime minister, isn't it odd that under the rules, the MP funds cannot be used for COVID? And if you can make an exception to the rules, this would be something worth doing. And I actually had written to the prime minister saying this. I told him, there is a letter waiting for you that requests this. The next day at lunch, Parliament was not meeting. I got a call from the speaker saying, I want you to know this idea has worked. You will get a government order this afternoon entitling you to spend MP funds for COVID. So I moved very quickly. And it was just as well I did, because it so happened that within 2 or 3 days, the government decided not only to keep the money to use the money for COVID, but to keep the money. And they canceled all the MP funds for the next 2 years and decided to use it. Fortunately, by then, I had allocated every rupee available to me. And I had done so for immediate urgent things, which in those days, people forget now, were grossly lacking. India had a major shortage of PPE. We didn't have any personal protective equipment for our doctors, nurses, healthcare personnel. We had a major shortage of testing devices. We had a major problem with respirators, oximeters, all sorts of things. Gloves were the one thing we had in quantity in India. We were exporting them, but pretty much everything else we needed, we didn't have, and therefore needed to be ordered. So I used in those first 24 to 48 hours, every rupee I had to make orders for all of these things for my constituency. Spoke to the Trivandrum Medical College doctors, spoke to the Indian Medical Association's chapter in Trivandrum, found out what their needs were, consulted the collector of the district and the district medical officer, drew up these requirements and started placing orders immediately. The biggest challenge was for testing kits, because those didn't exist. We happened to come across an article in the newspaper about a company in Pune that was going to be manufacturing testing kits in India for the first time. So somehow through somebody who knew someone, we contacted the chief of that company in Pune, and we placed an order for the very first batch they were going to manufacture. And literally the day they manufactured them, we said, we'll send you the money in advance, we want them. So we got that commitment. Then we had to get it from Pune to Trivandrum, and don't forget all the flights were canceled on those days. So the only flights that were running were cargo flights, were very limited ones and from very limited areas. So there was a flight from Bombay to Cochin, Cochin being by road about 6 hours from Trivandrum. But we said, let's get onto that. How do we get onto that? How do we get it to Bombay? So this is where my All India Professionals Congress came in helpful, because the head of one of our chapters was a professional who was a pilot. and he was a pilot for a different airline, but he decided through his connections to find out who was running this cargo flight from Bombay to Cochin. It was a rival airline, but he spoke to the captain of that flight and said, "Can you take this on board?" The captain agreed, of course, he paid for it. Then we had to organize transport from Pune to Bombay to deliver the kits as soon as they were manufactured. And then we had to organize transport from Kochi to Trivandrum to get them to the doctors in my constituency. So that required what you might call entrepreneurial skills. It required negotiation, it required bargaining, it required persuasion, it required logistics and organizing all of the stuff. But at the end of the day, within a few days of the lockdown being announced, Trivandrum became one of the very first places in the entire country to have a delivery of these kits, and in particular to have it from the first Indian manufactured batch in the country. And to my mind, there was an example of political entrepreneurship, which I was very proud of, and which my entire team, which did so much to make it work, the young pilots, we have a young volunteer in my office who's actually been the star of my COVID team, even though he's completely unpaid. This young man in Trivandrum has been running around organizing the logistics of all of these things and getting everything delivered. My entire team, everyone came through in a brilliant way. And this collaborative effort, which is again something important in entrepreneurship. Leadership and entrepreneurship is never about one individual alone. In fact, that one individual cannot achieve anything if others are resisting him or her. You can only achieve if you can manage to get a team together, get people to cooperate, attend to various things and get it done. I remember we needed to get a sensing device into Trivandrum for the railway station, because when trains were coming in with migrants and so on, other people were able to come in and out. There was no way of checking whether they were safe to come. So there was a device that was like a gate that you could put on the station to get it. But it was manufactured and available only in Europe, in fact, in Netherlands, I think. And we went through the most extraordinary convolutions to get it from the place of manufacture to an airport, from that airport to another airport, from there to on a third flight, and all of these procedures. Again, we finally got it to Trivandrum, like similar kind of process. And a final example on a humanitarian level was a family that appealed to me because they had a 2-year-old child with a very rare genetic disease that was potentially fatal. And that child's genes needed to be tested in a lab in Europe. And they had to be sent within a particular deadline, because when she crossed her second birthday or whatever, it'd be too late to find a remedy, whatever. And then the lockdown came and they were in an absolute panic. How do they get it? And that required a different kind of entrepreneurship yet, which is I spoke to two ministers. I spoke to the Minister of Civil Aviation and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and they both were incredibly helpful, and they activated their staffs. And somebody came from the government to this lady's home, picked up the sample, drove it to an airport, flew it to another airport, got it on a plane to Europe, where the Indian embassy, thanks to the foreign minister, picked it up and took it to the genetic testing lab. Now that's, again, I don't know if entrepreneurship is the word, but the ways in which we who are exercising, wielding whatever authority we can through elective office and politics, what we are able to do that helps the lives of people in our country is something that the public should always, I think, hold up as what politics ought to be all about. And the COVID experience gave me plenty of such examples of things I could do.
That's incredible, Dr. I do believe that entrepreneurship at the end of the day is about problem solving, and governance entrepreneurship is about public problem solving. So it's really great to hear your thoughts on that. Dr., before I hand over to our students, just one last question. You mentioned about negotiation. What's been your most hard-fought negotiation, either in the UN or in politics to date?
Oh, well, the UN, I have a lot more stories to tell. Which one do you want? I mean, you want a UN story? I can tell you a UN story now, which is, I guess, what had happened was that I was heading the UN office in Singapore during the boat people crisis in the early 80s. And we were there essentially to help the Singaporeans deal with the enormous problems of the Vietnamese boat people who were being rescued on the high seas, brought into the port of Singapore. The government couldn't jeopardize its port. And so they allowed these people to come. And then at the same time, they couldn't sit on the ships in the port. They had to be disembarked And so the government asked us to look after them. And that arrangement also then had one more component, which is we had to negotiate getting these people out of the country and sending them off to countries of resettlement so that the caseload would come down and Singapore would continue allowing more people to disembark. That was the arrangement. Now, while all this is going on, in a totally unrelated situation, Poland declared martial law. The communist government in Poland, under General Jaruzelski, declared martial law. And a Polish ship came into the harbor, and a whole bunch of Polish seamen who were associated with the Solidarity labor union movement, they jumped ship, looked up the telephone book, found the United Nations, called me and demanded asylum. Now, this is a very interesting challenge. I had to wake up my very senior director of international protection at the UN High Commission for Refugees in Geneva at 4 a.m. And say, what the hell do I do? And he said, look, you have a mandate. You interview them. If you think that they deserve refugee status, you recognize them and you negotiate it with the Singaporeans. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I did all of that. I felt that they could qualify as having a well-founded fear of persecution under international refugee law. I recognized them. Then I had to confront the Singaporeans with the fact that, that this was going to be a particularly awkward situation for all concerned if the Singaporeans didn't cooperate with me. Well, on that occasion, I was able to persuade them, and I was able to give these people temporary accommodations and a friendly Western country or two, especially the US, was able to take these people off to new lives out of Singapore, and the Singaporeans breathed easy. But the Singaporeans then banned shore leave for all Polish seamen. They didn't want any more incidents like this. So the Polish ships would come into the port and the Polish seamen were the only ones who couldn't get off. And this became a source of big tension. Then one day I was nursing a very bad flu. It was Chinese New Year, so it was a public holiday. My office was closed when I got a panicky call at home. This is the pre-mobile phone days. So I had to answer my landline. And this was the Foreign Secretary of Singapore, who had been previously the head of national intelligence. So he was a tough cookie and a very, very important player in national security issues. And he said, I have a problem. And I said, what's your problem? He said, well, a Polish seaman jumped off his ship and swam to an American destroyer in the port. He's on board the American destroyer. The Singaporean Coast Guard went after him, couldn't intercept him. And now the Americans are not letting him off the ship. And we have taken the stand that the American ship can't leave the port until they surrender the pole. So I said, listen, you have a problem here because this is a violation of international refugee law. So he said, yeah, and what's more, we have very delicate, sensitive relationships with both countries involved. Plus we have a port to run, which already at that point was the second or third busiest port in the world. We can't jeopardize port business. Solve the problem for me. So I, in my feverish state, I sort of thought about it. All right, here's what I'll do. You give me custody of the guy, and I'll persuade the Americans to release him to me. So then there was a complicated negotiation in which I spoke to the US consul. The US consul then contacted the ship's captain. The ship's captain was initially unwilling to let this seaman off, but since his ship was stuck from the Singaporeans' point of view until he got this guy off the ship and he wouldn't be allowed to sail, he agreed to hand him over to the US consul. The US consul then came back with a condition saying, you can have the guy for an interview to determine if he's a refugee, but it'll have to be on my premises because we're transferring him from US territory, a US destroyer, to US territory, a US consulate. Can you do this? So I told the Singaporeans I would do that. And I went to the US consulate muffled up because of my wretched flu. Interview.
Is there a problem with the audio?
In a cheap little boarding house in Singapore, which is all I had the money for in my office funds. And I said, with that, you have to let the ships go. And with this, the Singaporean said, fine, provided you keep it out of the papers. And I said, no problem. The entire thing was done hush-hush. To this day, it has never appeared anywhere in the public domain. It's now a story from December 81, so we're talking 39 years ago, no one cares anymore. But the destroyer sailed away, the ban on Polish shore leave remained, this Pole got away, the US consulate got its problem solved. The Singapore port went back to business. Relations with all countries were solved all through one incident, which required negotiating and entrepreneurship. And looking back on it, yeah, it's a tale for the memoirs, but there were many more stories like that in my UN days that made it richly rewarding to be working in these challenging situations. And my real reward was I got a postcard a couple of months later from San Diego, California, from the sailor saying, "I never know forget you, Mr. Shashi. I never know forget you," has stayed engraved in my heart ever since.
That's a fascinating. Yeah.
Why don't we take some questions from the class? Can you please use the hand button to raise your hands and we can come to you. Rachita, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I think that's the perfect time actually, because my question is related to the UN. So I was wondering that the UN, when it was formed, is like its primary function was sort of, this mediating, negotiating between countries to ensure peacekeeping and promote human rights. And so I was wondering, in like past decade, especially, with the world has sort of seen this uprising with conflict, whether it's Yemen, Palestine, Syria, and so I was just curious, since you've worked with the UN, do you think that the UN is sort of losing its significance or its role as a mediator? And what structural changes can sort of help it rescue it from doomsday?
Rachita, that's not entirely fair, but it's not entirely inaccurate either. The answer is it varies according to the situation. The UN is actually an indispensable player or mediator in some cases. Mediator is what you asked, but it also applies to keeping the peace and negotiating a peace, various other roles, but mediation is also amongst them. The UN becomes an indispensable player when the parties to a conflict actually need an impartial, above the fray, third party to come in and solve their problem. When you have parties that are completely unreconcilable or key parties in the fray that are not interested in a settlement, then you need a tremendous amount of political will to impose something upon them. And the UN is very rarely able to muster that kind of political will, largely because the UN is most effective when all member states on the Security Council agree on an issue. And when the member states don't agree, and these days in particular, there are real differences between often Russia and China on the one hand, the West on the other. Sometimes America has a distinct position even from the West. In all of these circumstances, you find that when the council is divided, when there is disagreement, that the UN is decidedly less effective. And there will even be situations where the UN is kept out of a particular problem because the feeling is that the UN will not be able to find the tools to deliver the answers, and governments would prefer to do it themselves. I've witnessed this very intimately in dealing with the former Yugoslavia, which was the problem that I was in charge of from 1991 to 1996. And during that period, we had all sorts of crises, which we don't have the time to go into now, but which were absolutely illustrative of this basic principle, that to succeed at the UN, because the UN is a mirror of the world and reflects our agreements and disagreements, you really need agreement and you need political will to be actually effective. Where there's will, where you have the resources you need, the human resources, the military troops, the financial backing, etc., from the member states, then you can get things done. But to have those resources, you need political will, and that political will cannot be a divided will, because if it's divided, you will not be able to achieve what you wanted to.
Great. Next question. I think I'd seen Anirudh raise his hand. Anirudh, go ahead.
Hi. So, first of all, thank you so much, sir. And sir, in today's world, we're seeing the influence of social media constantly on the rise. While it is being used positively as a medium to attract audience, we're also seeing it being used negatively to spread fake news and push false claims forward, especially in a political context. Now, given your presence on social media, I would just like to understand how to maintain this balance and where the line needs to be drawn in terms of political attacks.
Yeah, it really isn't easy, I must admit. And I have to say that you're talking about something which in many ways is ubiquitous. None of us escape social media, whatever our age, whatever our professions. And social media can often be both influencers and recyclers of prejudice. They often reinforce people's worst beliefs by making people realize that they're not the only ones who hold these prejudices, because other people are up there saying these things. And so I do worry very much that that social media, because it's directly created by the citizens of our country and is at the same time directly accessible to everyone, both the leadership and the ordinary people, can often be manipulated, and manipulated not just for political advantage, which I think is fair game, but also sometimes for rather malicious ends. You know, people have died because of fake stories on social media, and that's something that we should never really afford to finish. Now, we are in a country now where, with increasingly cheap mobile phones and the world's cheapest internet data, more and more people are using social media on their phones. So I remember as late as the 2014 election, people were saying that, oh, maybe about 80 million Indians will be using social media. When I used social media in that election, I was considered kind of a freak. You know, you can't. The assumption was it's not politically relevant to be on social media. Today, a huge majority is on social media. And I would argue probably over 50% of our voters as well. And there are no real reliable studies of how effectively all this works. Now, let me say that there's also the indirect impact of social media as a source for mainstream media. Because very often, you know, somebody will tweet something and the next day you'll see in the newspapers a story of something said by that person on social media. So all of this is going on. Disinformation is rife, as I've said. And we've heard this talk of the post-truth era because of the fact that in social media, lies very often gain ground and are believed. The jokes about, oh, did you get your degree from WhatsApp University? Because of the enormous amount of completely absurd and fake stories that go around on WhatsApp and are believed because of the repetition of those stories. And yet at the same time, I think social media offers a marvelously useful set of communications tools. It democratizes communication. People whose voices were never heard before can be heard. So how do we, on the one hand, social media is strengthening democracy that way. On the other hand, it is actually undermining democracy itself by soiling the currency of discourse. And the real challenge is, as you said, how to strike a balance. But who gets to strike the balance? To be honest, if you leave it to the government to strike a balance, you're asking for trouble. Because governments specialize in restrictions, regulations, censorship, and so on. And once you give the government that place, the freedom that you've enjoyed will no longer be relevant. To my mind, therefore, the best thing is to use good information to drive out the bad. And that means to actually educate people better in how to do things like fact checking. If I left to me, I would have a course in every high school as to how to use social media and how to learn how to avoid sexual predators on social media, how to avoid being taken for a ride by fake news, how to have half a dozen reliable fact-checking sites, national and international, that you can go to check out every story. Just get into the habit. And, you know, many of us, because we were educated in the old-fashioned way from very serious, you know, profound textbooks and deeply researched works and articles and so on, we have a frame of reference already in our head that helps us to sift the wheat from the chaff, and we can see a WhatsApp story and immediately say, well, that's fake, that's nonsense, that can't be. But many people in today's world who haven't grown up in that environment don't have that fail-safe instinctive mechanism in their heads, and for them, the balance, I think, must come from a serious amount of education so that they can actually challenge the falsehoods and the fake news. As I said, we really have to worry about a medium that thrives on sensationalism and unverified information. But we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We know it's an indispensable tool. And to my mind, therefore, to some degree, we'll have to live with a certain degree of abusiveness on social media because there will always be people who, given an opportunity and a platform, will abuse it. But if we can equip ourselves better to digest what it's offering us and to deal with it, that will be the right way to strike the balance. Even I get taken in once in a while, and there's no harm in being taken in by a relatively harmless thing. But I would never allow social media to incite me into turning against someone or or expressing a prejudice or saying something negative without double checking it twice. And I would urge you all to follow that rule of balancing, Anirudh, is your desire.
This is going to be music to the ears of one of our groups in the class, which is actually working on the issue of fake news. And their ask specifically is for a course to be developed at the high school level so that children can be taught how to differentiate between fake news and real news. So thanks so much for that perspective, Dr. Tharoor. Next question from Anukampa.
Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for taking out the time to speak with us today.
Sure, Anukampa.
And my question is related to organizing and working with people. So as we all know that bringing policy or system level change can take years. And I wanted to understand, how do you keep the people working with you or supporting your cause motivated and attached with you over those long periods of time where there may not be any interim success?
Very good question. And Anukampa, have we come across each other before? Because yours is such an unusual name that it sticks in my head from an earlier interaction. There was another Anukampa, not you, who asked me a question. But anyway, it's a lovely name. No, what I was going to say is that actually I don't always keep people very long. And it's not that I let them go. It's that I pick people who have a limited amount of time available to give me. So on the one hand, in my Trivandrum constituency office, I have one set of people who've been there right from the very beginning since I first set up that office as an MP in 2009, but they're just a handful, just a couple of people who go back that far, and others who've joined who are volunteering because of their own existing involvement in politics, and they've attached themselves to me as politicians. That's one kind of people, though they're the ones who will last in the constituency. But the office staff often comes and goes. And I'm very receptive to taking on young people, interns for the experience, who will work, who volunteer, and then who move on to do other things. In my Delhi office, that's actually been my actual philosophy. I didn't want to go for the tried and tested usual Sarkari Babus who occupy many MPs' offices in Delhi. So instead, I go for young people. The average age in my office is still around 25, 26. They're young people, usually right out of university or sometimes with 1 or 2 years work experience, who come to me for much less than they could earn elsewhere because I have to pay out of my own pocket. I don't have the kind of resources that any company would be able to pay them. But I give them not just an experience and exposure to something interesting, I give them empowerment. I give them a lot of a free hand to come up with ideas. And the way I work with people, and no one has to feel intimidated or feel afraid to express their views to me. And so people seem to enjoy working with me. And most people stay just 2 years. Now, we've had 2 or 3 exceptions, and I'm fortunate because there's some very good people who've been willing to stay on longer. But the understanding has always been that most of them see this as a way station to doing something else in their life, usually to going on to a better paying job, or in some cases to going on to graduate school. And so in the course of my 11, this is now, what is it? Yeah, the 11 years plus as an MP, I've had 5 good close assistants who have, I started off calling them assistants, now I call them chief of staff because they actually run the show in my Delhi office. And the average tenure of each of these has not been much more than 2 years. They come, they do good work, they move on to things that pay them 10 times more, but they always stay in touch. They remain friends because they've had a good experience here. And for me, therefore, there's almost a network of Shashi Tharoor's office alumni who continue to offer me goodwill and support and often even advice. For example, the writer Manu Pillai was one of my early assistants. Now he's busy doing his own books and his own thing and so on, but he still hasn't given up his email account in my office. And once in a while will forward something or give me a comment or draw my attention to something. And the same applies to many of his successors. I had a young lady who came to me from McKinsey and went to another firm in the UK. I had a young man who came to me from Deloitte in the UK after having graduated from a university in the UK. He's gone back to Deloitte, but he's still in touch, and we have these good contacts. But I also have a couple of colleagues in my current office who have served longer than the average. One has been with me for 4 years, one has been with me for 3, and I consider myself very lucky that they're willing to devote their prime of life in their 20s into serving the cause of, in this case, for all this time, an opposition MP. Often all the glamour and joy associated with being close to power, to go back to the first question that I was asked by Piyush, power. Well, I don't have any power, really. I have a certain role as an MP, and I hope, some influence sometimes, but very little power. A lot of what my team are doing for me is formulating requests that I then have to persuade people to agree to, rather than actually making policies that I get to decide and implement. And yet they've stayed on, so I consider myself very fortunate.
Thanks for that, Dr. Tharoor. I'm sensitive that
one last question is all I can give you, Piyush.
Yes, so I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Narayan, to ask that question, also give closing remarks for the session. Priyank, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. It's been a wonderful session, lovely stories, and we've really enjoyed listening to all the different experiences that you've had and will have, and drawing learnings from there. My question is actually a continuation of what you were talking about, which is that as change makers, as in this class, where are the opportunities for young people to come into governance and be entrepreneurs and be change makers that can move the system? And
well, I think it depends on how young people is. People who are just fresh out of university obviously will have to come in at a level where, at best, perhaps they might aspire to helping change makers and become change makers. To be in a change-making role right after university. So I think I don't want to give them false hopes. What they could do is work for MPs like myself. I know other fresh graduates who landed very interesting assignments in organizations like the Old Planning Commission, Niti Aayog, sometimes in the offices of ministers, sometimes in constituency MPs in their constituencies. If you come from an area where you're inspired by or attracted by what your MP is doing, you can go and volunteer to work for his constituency office. It'll be in most of our constituencies, we will not have people with the kind of educational qualifications that an Ashoka graduate is going to have. And so if you guys were to sort of, if one of you wanted to come in, of course, to work with me in Trivandrum, you'll have to know Malayalam, or to work with some MP in Chennai, you'll have to know Tamil, and so on. So language is, in our politics, a very important issue. But if you have an area where you have a home base, you have a language base or whatever, I would also encourage you to do that, because obviously politics from the grassroots also looks very different from sitting in a plush office in a government ministry in Delhi, or even in an MP's office in Delhi. So I would love to see many, many people coming up with these initiatives. Reach out to us. We'd be happy to welcome you. I certainly, as I said, have drawn from bright young people throughout my 11 years in politics. Sometimes we get some outstanding applications from people when there's no vacancy, and that's also the luck of the draw. Sometimes, the right person comes at the right time when there is an opportunity, and that's when we're able to say, okay, we're glad to have you. It fits in, come and join us. You can help. I can tell you right now, I have an incredibly brilliant young man who is still at university, in Columbia University in New York, who wrote in out of the blue offering himself as an intern. We took him on, and he did such outstanding work for us with research and writing that we felt it was too embarrassing to call him an intern after a few months. We gave him the title of research assistant. And if tomorrow or any other time he wants to come and join the staff, we know what we're getting. So that's something else you could think about, is to offer yourself, even as students, where you can work long distance or virtually or by internet, to people you want to work with in the future. Show what you can do by being an intern with them. And that's one way you can already get your foot in the door and have a head start on becoming a change maker yourself one day. Okay?
The idea of this course is to create many change makers and inspire them and be in positions of power and governance and make a true difference. So thank you so much for inspiring all of us with your journey and your story. And we hope that we can take this inspiration forward and make a meaningful difference for the country.
My pleasure, Priyank. Thank you so much for having me, Piyush and Priyank. All the best to all the students. Good luck. See you all one day in a post-COVID world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and Jai Hind.
Okay, class, we'll take a short break.